Thanks everyone for joining us today. This program was sponsored by the Brewster Ladies Library Association and its members. Tonight we're here for a virtual talk with Professor Michael Strmiska on the war in Ukraine after 2 years. And he's going to discuss the ups and downs of the war to this point from both the Ukrainian and Russian viewpoints, the human cost of the war, the death toll on both sides, Russia's kidnapping of Ukrainian children, the mixed record of the sanctions imposed on Russia, the success of Russia in forming links with China, Iran, North Korea, and the global South, the rallying of Western nations under President Biden's leadership, Ukraine's impressive military successes, including rapid technological adaptation, the anxiety of the Baltic States and Poland about what a Russian victory might mean for them, peace at any price. Should Ukraine keep fighting or let Russia have half of their country? The worst case scenario if the US turns away and tyranny is triumphant. Why Ukraine matters, why Americans should care. A little bit about our presenter. Michael Strmiska teaches world history and Asian history at SUNY Orange Community College in Middletown, New York, and is currently teaching a class on Russian and Eastern European history. He earned his PhD in religious studies at Boston University and has been awarded 2 Fulbright fellowships for teaching at universities in Lithuania and Latvia, as well as at the 2017 SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Research and Creative Activities. He visited Lithuania in January of this year and had many discussions with colleagues about the situation in Ukraine. He's working on a book discussing the important contributions made by the pagan, Jewish, Muslims, and Gypsy communities and religious traditions to the society of Eastern Europe. Before I turn this over to the professor, I just want to thank, there are several Cape Cod libraries who chipped in on this with me to promote the program. So in no particular order, I'd like to thank Edgartown, Mashpee, Yarmouth, Vineyard Haven, Hyannis, Cotuit, Weldon, Sturgis, Bourne, and Centerville. Take it away, Professor.
Okay, and as a point of procedure, Devin, if it's okay with you, I want to suggest to people that they put questions into the chat, and then maybe when we get to Q&A, you could read them for people.
Absolutely.
And of course, I'd still encourage people to, to speak up, but the advantage of the chat is if I don't get to some of your questions, we can save them. Devin can send them to me, and then I can send you some kind of response. Okay, so now let me get started, and thank you for the kind introduction, Devin. I have warm feelings for Cape Cod. I actually was on the Cape about a month ago and did stop by the Brewster Ladies Library, and I was impressed what a lovely building and historic building it is. Okay, without further ado, let me go to share screen, get the PowerPoint fired up. Okay, and where am I? Okay, do you have the full screen view now?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so let me get started here. The Ukraine war after 2 years, no easy answers. And below here, you see my email address. You can feel free to contact me if you want a copy of the lecture. I could send a PDF version, and also I can send a document with a list of the video links. I am using a lot of videos today, and I think that'll probably be the better part of the lecture, not at my actual speaking. So if you're interested in those videos, feel free to do that. Okay, so a bit of warning. This lecture will contain discussion and visual images of disturbing scenes of violence and cruelty. If you're not in a good state of mind for such things, do not stay for this lecture. You can email me at a later date for a version of the lecture to be sent to you. And once again, there's my email address. Okay, so to begin with, before we talk about the war today, or even about this war of the last 2+ years, it's important to understand that even before the all-out Russian invasion started on February 24th, 2 years ago, Ukraine was already under attack from and at war with Russia. On this map, you see toward the bottom the Crimean Peninsula with the stripes on it. And you see to the right side, the eastern side of the map, another striped region with sort of brownish stripes. So the Crimean Peninsula and this area of eastern Ukraine had both been occupied by Russian troops. Well, actually, I should make a distinction. There was an outright Russian occupation of Crimean Peninsula, and then in the Donetsk, or actually it's called the Donbas region, which includes the Donetsk area and the Luhansk area. That area came under assault from rebels, Ukrainians who were in alliance with Russians, and then eventually also Russian forces. This means that and this started in 2014, and this means that since that time, Ukraine has actually been in a state of conflict with Russia. And this, in some ways, was perhaps an advantage to Ukraine in facing the current onslaught because they already had been fighting Russia. They weren't starting from scratch. Okay, so now here is a map showing what happened on February 24th. You can see that Russia attacked from multiple directions. So let me ask you, think back, what were you doing on February 24th, 2022? Did you have a pleasant day? Did you walk your dog? Go shopping that day? Chat with your friends? Well, if you were in Ukraine that day, you were being invaded by Russia. And here you see front pages of newspapers from that day, the reaction of the world. Massive shock that this could be happening. So just note the headlines: Putin forces storm Ukraine. World leaders condemn attack. War in Ukraine. Russia push it to outskirts of capital. Ukraine alone, redrawing the map of Europe in blood. Ukraine's agony. And yet, just the day before, life was so different. What a difference one day can make. And now let me show you some images from a photo essay I found where a journalist explored what Ukrainians were doing the day before. So this is from literally the day before, February 23rd, 2022. A young woman taking a walk around Kiev, enjoying the pleasant weather. And I won't go through her whole text here, but she mentions that now she feels like it's from a different lifetime. And here's a father talking about activities with his daughter that day. Normal day with a child. She did a school project. He was praising her. Two friends went up to see the observation tower from a church in the city of Lviv. Felt very happy. Everything was so nice. But then it all changed. So on February 24th, people in Ukraine woke up to a vastly different reality, that their country was under attack from Russia. And now I'll show you some images from the first days of the attack. Imagine waking up to this. Massive destruction in multiple locations. Smoke rising, buildings being bombed. Here you see a bus shelter that was bombed. There might have been people standing there waiting for a bus. The bus never came, the bomb did. And here's a poignant image. This is Kiev, the capital city. On the right side, you see people trying to leave the city. On the left side, people coming into the city. Clearly, many more people are trying to leave because they're panicking. This is an image that appeared in multiple news accounts that day. This woman became kind of a poster girl for the invasion. She's a 52-year-old teacher standing outside a hospital after the bombing of her town. Soon the train stations were crowded. People who decided to leave were trying to get on trains, as well as buses, cars, whatever they could to get out of Ukraine. So there was a massive exodus from Ukraine. And in 2024, 1/10 of the country's population now lives outside Ukraine. Subway stations became bomb shelters, and they remain so until today. In fact, I'm sure someone will do an interesting study of the use of the subway stations as bomb shelters, that it's almost an alternate city underground now with multiple functions, children going to school, all kinds of things taking place now. And the reason the bomb shelters are so safe is they're very, very deep down. I have been to Kiev. I visited there twice in the year 2015, and I saw this great subway system, but I did notice you had to ride the escalators quite a way to get to the actual platform for the trains. And that's a blessing for a time like this. Okay. And another view of entrance to a subway station. Okay.
The Russian president says a military operation is now underway in eastern Ukraine. Ukraine has declared a state of emergency.
The full-scale invasion that intelligence officials have been warning about for weeks is now underway, and there are reports of explosions and attacks at several major Ukrainian cities. Starting in the city of Kiev, there have been reports of explosions. This video from Ukraine's National Border Guard Service. It is said to be surveillance camera video, so it's silent. But what you can see in these pictures are a road near the border with Belarus. And you can see what Ukrainian officials say is a cone of Russian armor crossing into Ukrainian territory from the north. This is more video from the Ukrainian Border Guard Service, this time from the south. And officials say that shows Russian military trucks and other forces crossing into Ukraine from Crimea. So they are coming in from the north, from the south, from very much everywhere. Well, some people are leaving, some people are staying.
I was getting audio before, but seemed to have lost it with that last clip.
Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky addressed.
Now it's back.
Сегодня я инициировал телефонный разговор с президентом Российской Федерации. Результат – тишина. Zelensky then switched from Ukrainian to Russian, making an emphatic plea to the Russian people to oppose their government and to bring about peace.
Okay, doesn't have any lemon flavor. And in it, he essentially declared war on Ukraine. Putin had called it a special operation in the Donbass, but of course, that's not what we're seeing. I mean, we're talking about a huge swath of Ukraine right now being under attack. And in his speech, Putin gave a very chilling warning, basically saying that if the West interferes with this, if any country interferes with this, Russia will respond, and it's already had this space.
Will be diplomatically a pariah on the scale of North Korea. If the West's response is not maximum sharpness and strength, then I think the European security order itself is at risk.
What we have to do, of course, as a country, as a NATO member, as a country that, in fact, is home to 1.3 million Canadians of Ukrainian descent.
Yeah.
We were the first country to recognize Ukraine. We are arguably their closest ally. And so they're looking to us. They're looking to us for humanitarian aid, for more sanctions, more financial aid. And this, sadly, they need lethal weapons.
So that gives you some flavor of the early days and the international reaction. One curious thing about the Russian invasion is that Putin insisted it not be called a war. The preferred term was special military operation, trying to preserve a nonsensical distinction. Now, the next point I want to make is that in the early days of the war, many expected that Kyiv, the capital, and the government would quickly fall, and that Russia would quickly take over Ukraine and impose a new government. But Kyiv did not fall. Against incredible odds, the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians back. Their innovative tactics amazed the world. And now I'll show you another clip that explains this operation.
You might have to reshare with the audio, Professor. It's silent on my end.
Okay, so should I stop share and start over?
Yeah.
All right.
And then when you go to share the YouTube screen, before you complete the share, there's a checkbox for audio.
Oh, very good. Right, I forgot that before. Sorry about that. So the previous one, you didn't have the audio either?
No, I did have that one for most of
Very
it.
strange. Okay, well, anyway, let me make sure of that. Okay. There, that should be better. Okay, try again.
Much better.
On the night of February 24th, Russia attacked Ukraine from 10 different directions. The aim was to capture the capital, Kyiv, a metropolis with a population of over 3 million, and assign a puppet government. However, in the end, the battle for Kyiv became Russia's biggest defeat. In his visit to Moscow in 2021, the head of the CIA had to deal with extremely arrogant opponents. The US ambassador attending that meeting stated that Putin's officials were openly saying, "We're strong, we can attack Ukraine, and you won't stop us." However, neither American or European nor Ukrainian politicians believed a full-scale offense of one civilized country onto another is possible in the 21st century. Yet Ukrainian militaries believed, so they decided to play safe. And as it turned out, it was the right decision.
All the city officials, heads of districts, and law enforcement agencies were gathered, and the plan of defense of Kyiv was approved. That is, we all already knew who, how, and where will defend our country if this invasion begins.
On the eve of the invasion, Ukrainians started to withdraw equipment and soldiers from their bases. When more than 150 Russian missiles hit Ukrainian headquarters, warehouses, and bases in the middle of the night on February 24th, most of the military equipment and people were already out of place. Simultaneously, with the missile attack, the sky was attacked by approximately 75 Russian warplanes. This is the same number as Ukraine had on the eve of the attack. However, Ukrainian aircraft and air defense systems that were removed from the bases of deployment resisted and did not allow Russians to control the airspace, to their big surprise. At the same time, enormous columns of armored machinery marched on Kyiv from different directions. Through surveillance cameras, Ukrainians saw hundreds of tanks crossing the border from all sides. It seemed impossible to stop the Russian invasion. The New York Times quoted an order to a Russian soldier to follow the vehicles ahead of him and reach Kyiv in 18 hours. the Russians set aside several days for the complete capture of the Ukrainian government. One of the definable encounters in the Battle of Kyiv happened on a small suburban airfield, Hostomel. Numerous videos filmed by regular Ukrainians show that hours after the invasion began, the airfield was attacked by at least 40 helicopters flying at a low altitude above peaceful cottages. The idea was to capture the runway and use it for landing large planes with troops and equipment. Deploying such forces 10 kilometers away from the capital would have made holding the city impossible. The plan seemed flawless. The area around the aerodrome was protected by an understaffed National Guard brigade armed only with mortars and small arms. However, under the helicopters' fire, they battled elite Russian paratroopers. Once retreating, they also damaged the runway to obstruct the landing of transport aircraft. The next day, the troops of the armed forces of Ukraine approached the captured airfield. During fierce clashes, the runway was passed from hand to hand. The Telegraph called this defeat a Russia's humiliating retreat.
You know that some of this was a symbolic place that the Russian aggression was started here. They're trying to deploy here the parachute troopers here and starting the occupation of the capital of our country. And our army kicks them out. That's it.
However, the danger was still not over. The satellite shots showed a 65 kilometers long column of armored vehicles moving toward Kyiv. However, the plan to quickly reach the capital has also failed. Heavy machinery has damaged the roads and got stuck in the mud. Instead of reaching Kyiv in 18 hours, Russians got stuck in northern Ukraine for days, and later for weeks. The New York Times warned, the battle for Kyiv will be a long and ferocious confrontation. Another key point in this confrontation was the small village of Moshchun, 19 miles from the Ukrainian capital.
I was not sure that we would be able to hold the positions. We were at the battalion's command and observation post for almost 24 hours, and all the reserve forces we had at the time were deployed.
However, due to its position, Moshchun could become a kind of gateway to Kyiv for the Russians, so they sent large forces here. The village changed hands several times, so the fate of Kyiv and in fact the entire war depended on just a few dozen Ukrainian soldiers, whether they could close the road to the capital. In the end, 85% of the village, with beautiful suburban cottages, was destroyed in combat. However, it withstood. Russians were stuck there for almost a month, and then were forced to retreat. However, another mistake emerged at this point. Russians didn't prepare enough water, food, and fuel. Damaged roads and Ukrainian resistance slowed the enemy's advance to a point when they ran out of supplies. Eventually, the Russian army started to break into stores and houses of peaceful citizens as they advanced. Subsequently, hundreds of dead Ukrainian civilians with traces of torture, thousands of destroyed houses, and other evidence of war crimes were found in the territories temporarily occupied by Russia. Ultimately, the matter of surviving has become their main concern.
So I think they thought they only had 3 days as well. So they brought 3 days worth of gas, 3 days worth of food. So once the third day, they could not go further because they were facing resistance from that.
The north of Ukraine is a wooded area. Russians moved through it, sometimes using 40-year-old maps for navigation, which Ukrainians later found on enemy's positions. Meanwhile, Ukrainian fighters knew their native places exceptionally well. The innovative tactic was based on the following. Ukrainian soldiers moved quickly on ATVs, striking the first and the last armored vehicle in a column from behind the trees. Later on, the artillery or drones systematically destroyed the equipment that got stuck in between. Apart from that, Ukrainians have blasted numerous bridges and the Irpin River Dam outside of Kyiv. The water spill had significantly impeded Russian advance. Inhabitants of Dmitiv village, which was flooded after the dam collapse, later said, "It's better to have water in our houses than Russians."
So Kiev was spared an all-out Russian invasion, but many other locations in Ukraine were not so lucky. And one particular city, a very large city that has been almost totally destroyed by the Russian attack, is Mariupol on the eastern side of Ukraine. There is an amazing documentary that was made, Mariupol Out of Range, and you can actually find the entire film on YouTube. But here I'm just going to show a clip from it.
Я с города Мариуполя. Я мама 3 деток. Я была управляющей в ресторане. Муж работал на заводе «Азовсталь».
Я захоплювався фотографією, фотографував Маріуполь, мешканців Маріуполя. В кожної фотографії у неї своя історія.
Я продавала воздушные шары. У меня был свой бизнес. Я занималась оформлением праздников. У меня был свой магазин.
Обычная семья, которая строила какие-то планы, у которой были какие-то мечты, которые в какое-то время просто это все оборвалось.
О 4 ранку за київським часом звернувся Путін.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Покажите этому путинскому, что он сдох.
Усе, що окупанти роблять з Маріуполем, це вже за межою миру.
Почали гинути українці. Почали горіти міста, бомбити міста, і в тому числі і наш Маріуполь.
Особисто мене з Маріуполем пов'язує мій брат. Я сестра виконуючого обов'язки 36-ї окремої бригади морської піхоти Сергія Волинського, позивний Волина. Це моя опора. Зараз хвилинку заспокоюсь.
— 27 марта меня задержали на блокпосту на выезде из города Мариуполь.
Что это ты? Кто такая? Чего ты решила, что ты кого-то можешь спасти?
Сейчас мы тебе объясним, где твое место.
So it was a really terrible situation in Mariupol. And the city's taken on a special significance because there were a number of journalists there who were able to document what happened there in great depth and detail. And one film, or I've already shown you a bit of one film, but here is another film called 20 Days in Mariupol. This film actually won the 2024 Academy Award for Best Documentary. Here is the trailer. And again, you can find the full film online if you're interested. And again, warning, it's not for the faint of heart. It's very depressing, this violence and suffering.
Someone once told me, wars don't start with explosions. They start with silence.
Лично видим визуально. Танки зашли с надписью Z.
Город Мариуполь блокирован со всех сторон.
Russians have entered the city. The war has begun, and we have to tell its story.
Хорошо, что тут есть пресса. Снимайте.
This is painful to watch, but it must be painful to watch.
Вони нанесли бомбовий удар. Вон там! Хирургический корпус, вот там вот!
А, вы госпитале, да?
Мама, что?
Не знаешь, куда бежать.
Чего расстраиваешься?
не хочу, чтобы я умирала.
Репортажи ваши разошлись. Конечно, огромное дело сделать.
Они столько пережили с мамами.
If the world saw everything that happened in Mariupol, it would give at least some meaning to this horror. My brain will desperately want to forget all this, but the camera will not let it happen.
And let me mention that among the horrors of this war is that so many civilian facilities have been attacked, bombed. Schools, hospitals, museums, all kinds of facilities. And what is underway is not just an attempt to take over this country, but an attempt to destroy the conditions of life in Ukraine. I would say it has unfortunate parallels to what we see in Gaza right now. In places like Mariupol, so much is being destroyed that life is going to be basically impossible there. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through some slides to show you the progression of the war. In the upper left corner, you have a map that shows you the situation before the invasion began. So again, you see those two regions. Crimea had already been occupied by the Russians, and then that mustard color area of Donbass, that had been under Russian attack. So then in the next screen, you see how the Russians have taken over these salmon-colored areas, but the Ukrainians are pushing back. And then if we go to the lower left corner screen, you see those purple areas. Those were areas where Ukraine has reclaimed territory. So the Ukrainians have had some success in pushing the Russians back, at least in the first 2 years. So in January 2024, this is where the war stood. So you see again, those mustard color areas, those were reclaimed by Ukraine. And those contain some very important areas like the city of Kharkiv. But those salmon colored areas remain under Russian occupation. And now this is where things stand in April right now. And unfortunately, the trend in recent months is that Russia is having success pushing beyond their previous area of control. And the reason for this is very simple. The Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. They're running out of supplies, whereas the Russians are well equipped. So the Ukrainians are fighting back with minimal supplies and facilities. And unless they can receive more supplies, more military equipment, more ammunition from different countries, most of all the US, there is a frightening chance they really could lose this war and become totally occupied by Russia. So let me take you through the first couple years of the war. Devin, can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, because I've lost my own view of myself. I'm only seeing the PowerPoint. I want to just make sure. I don't want to just be talking to myself. I do enough of that. Okay, so the next few screens, I'm going to show you the progression of the war in 2022 and 2023 from both Ukrainian and Russian point of view. So in 2022, the initial Russian attack was successfully pushed back by the Ukrainians to some extent. And their ability to push back the Russians surprised many who expected a rapid rapid Russian victory and the quick collapse of the Zelensky government. The USA and other Western countries were initially slow to provide military aid, but this increased over time, continually improving Ukrainian military capacity. I'll give you one example of that. Right away, when the war started, Zelensky said, we need fighter jets. Western countries, USA, give us fighter jets so we can defend ourselves in the skies. And America and other countries were reluctant to do that. They were afraid it would be too provocative toward Russia, who they don't want to provoke into a possible nuclear war. And so this demand went unmet for 2022. But in 2023, the thinking shifted, and now the Ukrainians are being supplied with modern Western jets, such as USA's F-16 fighter jet, and Ukrainian pilots are now training to use these weapons. But the time lag is a problem. If they could have used those weapons, those jets right away, they'd be much farther ahead. But the delay has cost lives and territory. Nevertheless, the Western countries under President Biden's leadership did rally to support Ukraine, and also brought in others like Japan and South Korea and Australia. The NATO alliance pulled together in a unified pro-Ukrainian stance, and the EU and others imposed sanctions on Russian businesses. President Zelensky was hailed as a hero in many other countries, and when he visited the US in the fall of 2022, he received a bipartisan standing ovation in Congress. A year later, 2023, when he visited again, the Republicans in Congress would not even allow him to address the Congress. And that relates to an issue of the shifting Republican point of view, which I'll come back to later. Now let's look at 2022 from the Russian point of view. The initial Russian attack pushed very deep into Ukrainian territory and almost reached Kiev, but then was turned back by the surprisingly capable Ukrainian defenses, some of which you saw in the video clip. Russian forces had many problems. They proved poorly equipped and coordinated, and the Ukrainians found weaknesses to exploit. Sadly, since that time, the situation is changing. The Russians are becoming better organized and more adapted to fighting in Ukraine. The sanctions imposed by the USA and the EU forced Russia to reach out in other directions to seek parts for their own military and to sell oil to support their economy. And this substantially undercut the sanctions being imposed. Russia successfully blocked Ukraine's Black Sea ports and shut down its exports of grain and other items, doing massive damage to the Ukrainian economy and also sparking food shortages and price hikes worldwide. So this was something that contributed to the massive spike in inflation that we saw in 2022. Okay, now let's go to 2023, starting with the Ukrainian side. Increasing shipments of military aid to Ukraine in the spring of 2023 raised hopes of a summer offensive in which Ukraine could make major gains pushing Russia back. These hopes were not realized. The offensive stalled, making only minor gains of territory, and Russia retook territory in some places. And it should be pointed out that one of the reasons for the underperformance of the summer offensive is that the Ukrainians were still not receiving all the weapons and military equipment that they had requested. So you could say they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back. By the fall, many saw the situation as essentially a stalemate, including Ukraine's top general. On the more positive side for Ukraine, Finland joined NATO, with Sweden on the way, which now has happened in 2024, making NATO larger and more powerful than ever. and showing unified European resolve versus Russia. Also, using drones and other technology, Ukraine largely disabled the Russian Navy and managed to carve out a coastal shipping route, restoring a substantial degree of its Black Sea trade and boosting Ukrainian economy. On the negative side, late in 2023, Republicans in the USA, led by Donald Trump, raised the frightening specter of a total cutoff of US military aid. So initially, many Republicans were supportive, but by the end of 2023, they were starting to shift their stance away from Ukraine. So now let's look at 2023 from the Russian point of view. Overall, Russian forces had begun to adapt to Ukrainian tactics and were becoming more successful in holding off Ukrainian attacks while gaining small amounts of new territory. The stalemate that has developed was massive death in trench warfare. And let me comment that in the world history class I teach at my community college in New York State, when we've talked about World War I in the last couple of semesters, I've been able to say, incredibly, the horror of trench warfare is being repeated today in Ukraine with the massive death on both sides. And this mass death is favorable to Russia because it has a bigger population, it can recruit more soldiers, and thus it can afford to lose more soldiers. And in a quite horrifying reality, the Russian military has proven it is willing to expend soldiers, to send them forward in human waves. And though many die, some will break through. And again, this is the classic horror of trench warfare. Russia has shifted to a war economy. Its military manufacturing has ramped way up. And on the Western side, Western countries have not been able to match that because they were not planning for this. But we do see signs now that Germany and other countries are advancing their manufacturing of military equipment. And so is Ukraine. The Russian economy in 2023 remains stable, not collapsing as was once hoped by Ukraine and its Western allies. Russia also helped its economy by finding new trading partners to replace its former markets in Europe and the USA. And some of these trading partners include China and India. Russia has also used oil and offers of military and other forms of aid to develop friendly relations with countries in Africa and the global South. And let me briefly comment that many countries in the global South, what we used to call the Third World, in Africa and Latin America, have a positive attitude toward Russia because they remember the Cold War period when the Soviet Union often gave a lot of aid to such countries. Russia has also found new sources of military equipment and supplies, in particular from North Korea, which has provided a lot of ammunition, and Iran, which has been a major source of drones. One very interesting contrast in the course of the war to this point. Russia was doing fairly well on land, holding on to most of the territory it seized in the previous year, and in some cases advancing. Ukraine, however, was doing much better at sea, blowing up a considerable number of Russian Navy ships and opening a lane along its Black Sea coast for ships to export grain. The Ukrainian success on the Black Sea is especially impressive because it does not have a navy. So you may wonder, how could it bring the Russian Navy to its knees? Well, the answer is creative use of drones, disabling the Russian fleet to a considerable extent. So the course of the war to this point, in a way, it's a tale of Russian missiles on land and Ukrainian drones at sea. Okay, and now I'm going to show you a video that will explain the use of drones by the Ukrainians and how successful it has been fighting against, in this case, the Russian army.
Russian tanks that cost
Is the sound okay?
Yeah, it's working.
over $1 million are being taken out by cheap consumer-style drones. Like this one that cost a few $100s. Since the Ukrainian counteroffensive began, military analysts say there's been a dramatic increase in Ukraine's use of FPV, or first-person view, drones, with most Ukrainian battalions using these drones to execute kamikaze-style attacks on Russian tanks, troop positions, and other large-scale weapons. The aim is twofold: to make the military less dependent on weapons from Western countries, and to operate cheaply. The Wall Street Journal collected dozens of attack videos from Ukrainian drone teams and spoke to analysts from Jane's Intelligence to break down how these attacks were executed. Kamikaze drones must get very close to a target and remain undetectable. To execute an attack like this, FPV drone pilots work in teams to identify targets and get into position to strike. The team usually includes a driver to get to the attack location and 2 drone pilots, one for the attack or kamikaze drone and one for a reconnaissance drone. The optimal flight distance for missions is roughly 1 to 2 miles to the target, but they can launch from as far as 7 miles. One way they evade detection is by using low-quality cameras on FPVs. The signals these cameras transmit are less likely to be scrambled by Russian electronic warfare systems. Before launching, the operators attach explosives to the kamikaze drone with tape and hardware. The attack drone operator wears a virtual reality-style headset to control the drone. After launching, a reconnaissance drone looks for the target. In this footage from the Zaporizhzhia region, near the city of Orikhiv. It's a Russian truck. Ukrainians targeted it because it was carrying ammunition to Russian troops. The attack drone follows the truck as it turns and crashes into it, detonating its payload. When striking a supply truck like this, a drone pilot will aim for the cabin to take out the driver. The strategy is similar when targeting tanks. The most vulnerable spot on a tank is its engine compartment, located here on the rear side. Drone pilots often aim for them, as in this attack from behind. The drones strike the weakest points on tanks and heavy machinery like these infantry fighting vehicles. Here, the open hatch is a vulnerability the pilot likely noticed. The pilot appears to hit the turret, where some of the vehicle's crew sit, and ammunition is stowed. Here, a kamikaze drone strikes a Russian truck that lays landmines. On these trucks, pilots target the mine modules. Deterring these trucks is key, as minefields have been a major obstacle in Ukraine's fight to regain territory. The failure rate of missions can be high, according to Ukrainian units we spoke to. Russian firepower can knock these drones out of the sky if discovered, as shown by this near miss. About 100 Ukrainian companies manufacture FPVs, 40 of which receive government contracts. Most of the parts these companies use come from China and are becoming difficult to source. Ukraine's use of these DIY-style weapons is rapidly evolving. And now, Russia is catching up.
Okay, and let me just also give you a clip to show how on the Black Sea, drones are also being used to disable or destroy Russian ships. This is from an attack from a couple of months ago.
Ukraine's military says it has destroyed another Russian warship in the Black Sea. It says the vessel sank near Alupka, a city on the Crimean Peninsula, which Moscow illegally annexed 10 years ago. Kyiv says it used naval drones to sink the Caesar Kunikov, a large landing ship, saying it was in Ukrainian territorial waters at the time. This is the second time in 2 weeks that Ukrainian forces have claimed to have sunk a Russian vessel in the Black Sea. DW's Nick Connolly has more details from the Ukrainian authorities.
Well, we've seen some video which they say shows these naval drones attacking this big landing ship off the coast of Crimea, as you mentioned there. It wasn't in port, it was kind of off the south coast of the Crimean Peninsula. We also know that this is a ship that had already been damaged back in the early phase of the war when it had been in the Russian-occupied port of Berdyansk, and that time it had survived, unlike another ship that was in port next to it and had been rebuilt, had been made seaworthy again. That now seemingly no longer possible. We understand from these Ukrainian sources that basically a large hole was created on its left side, and that has led to it taking on water and being beyond recovery. As for the rescue operation, we don't have any details now if those Russian...
Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay. So Ukraine is having some amazing successes despite limited resources. And I think one of the main points to take away from this lecture is that what happens in this war will depend largely on what resources are made available to Ukraine. The Ukrainians are proving they're very brave, creative, they can fight very well, but they can only do so much if they don't have the proper equipment, ammunition, supplies, and resources. Now, here's a more personal view of the war, a profile of a young woman who's become a commander in the Ukrainian military.
15 months ago, Olga Biga was a lawyer and a PhD student. Now she's the commander of a mortar unit and a veteran of the Battle of Bakhmut.
In Bakhmut, you understand that your life and all things that you thought before is important are not important, absolutely.
Her unit spent 5 months on the front lines fighting Russian forces in one of the bloodiest battles of the 21st century.
You see how our buildings and houses are blowing up, how people are dying, and you understand at that moment that we have something more important than money, that real estate, that cars, and we have very important thing, our freedom, democracy, and law.
Olga, whose call sign is Witch, documented her days on the front lines on TikTok, where she has more than 100,000 followers. A fierce fighter on the battlefield, she's just as important off it, inspiring a war-weary nation.
I just made a small video that everything is okay in Bakhmut. And then I've tried to make this video every day when I've been to Bakhmut.
What she saw there was unimaginable.
In Bakhmut, we've seen the real face of Russia.
What is that real face that you saw there?
A face of murder. We've seen cruelties and medieval things in Bakhmut.
The Wagner mercenary group says it lost 20,000 troops in Bakhmut. Olga describes them as cruel and mad. She says they forced their own troops at gunpoint to demine her unit's defensive positions.
The Russians are using people for demining territories.
So
that's medieval.
So you're saying they're using people to step on mines?
Yes.
And
to make a hole in our defense and then to attack our positions.
Only 3 members of Olga's platoon are professional soldiers. The rest include economists, lawyers and businessmen. She says they've been busy training and are confident of success in the planned counteroffensive.
We have really good people who knows how to fight with a good battle experience. So I'm sure that counteroffensive will be successful.
And they'll be led into battle by the commander who will do all to defend her country. Steve Canane, ABC News.
The next clip is about a young American who's gone to fight in Ukraine on behalf of the Ukrainians. And this clip takes us deeper into the trauma, the horror of the war.
This morning, we have a very revealing look at the war in Ukraine from an American volunteer who fought in it. Ukraine's army is preparing to try and recapture the key southern city of Kherson and fighting off Russian attacks in the northeast. Ukraine's president says Russian artillery strikes are, quote, driving people to their deaths. Holly Williams is in Kyiv, that's Ukraine's capital city, with more on the story. Holly, good morning to you.
Good morning. We've been reporting on this war now for over 8 months, and it's extremely rare to get an unvarnished account of what it's like at the tip of the spear as Ukraine battles Russia's invasion. But that's exactly what we heard from an American who volunteered to fight with Ukrainian forces. And we should warn you that his interview contained some disturbing material.
You could hear shooting, but then you could also hear grunts and people like fighting to the death with their bare hands. It's a very unique sound when you hear that many death rattles.
He's from Tennessee, he told us, and came to fight in Ukraine because he was horrified by the Russian invasion. He wants to be known only by his call sign, Elvis.
The carnage you're describing sounds like something out of World War II.
Yeah, this is nothing like any conflict in the past 70 to 80 years. This war is not sustainable for either side.
On the front line in southern Ukraine, he says he repeatedly witnessed Russian forces using white phosphorus munitions.
It comes down extremely slow, but there's nothing you can do, and everything it touches just incinerates.
Including this incident.
Probably about 20 or 30 guys burning alive, and several gunshots, because there was nothing else they do. So a lot of guys have suicide pistols, and you'd hear them scream, and then they would say goodbye and then blow their own heads off.
So you actually heard 20 to 30 soldiers being burned alive by white phosphorus?
Yes, ma'am.
And some of them committing suicide
Yes,
with their
ma'am.
own pistols?
Yes, ma'am.
Elvis, that must have been horrific.
It's war. At least that's what I tell myself.
He admits that he's traumatized and fears one of his former comrades could commit suicide because of what they went through together.
This morning.
Yeah, I think that clip really drives home the brutality and horror of this conflict. And now let me give you an overview of the war through the end of 2023. Russia has lost more soldiers than Ukraine, 200,000 to 130,000, but it has a much bigger population to draw on, 143 million in Russia compared to 44 million in Ukraine. 1/10 of the Ukrainian population has left the country, mostly women and children. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been abducted to Russia. And just this week, there was a very moving documentary on PBS of Ukrainian efforts to recover children who've been kidnapped into Russian occupied territory. The Russians are trying to brainwash the children, and with some teenage boys, they're actually trying to quickly convert them into Russian soldiers to go back into Ukrainian territory and kill Ukrainians. It's horrific. It's against all international law. It's a war crime. Russia has lost nearly 1 million people who have left Russia to live elsewhere. Many of these people fleeing Russia now are highly skilled and educated. So Russia is losing its best and brightest. On the Ukrainian side, 4 million Ukrainians have lost their homes. Many Ukrainian towns and cities have been damaged or destroyed. This includes schools, hospitals, museums. What is underway? I'm sorry, take a drink here. What is underway is not only an attempt to conquer, but to destroy the culture of Ukraine. Because the clear attempt of Russia, of Putin, is to claim Ukraine as Russian territory. And there will probably be little place for Ukrainian culture, and there'll be an attempt to Russify the society if Russia prevails. And now let's look at recent events, 2024, starting with the Ukrainian point of view. The overriding factor here is the failure of the USA to provide needed military aid. This is allowing Russia to launch increasingly devastating attacks on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Ukraine is running short on artillery shells, ammunition, and the components for the Patriot air defense system, which until this year was helping to protect Ukrainian cities from massive attack. That defense is now weakening, and we're seeing increasing damage to Ukrainian cities. Ukraine can no longer defend itself as it did in 2022 and 2023. If in 2023, Ukraine could be said to have been holding its own, it is now steadily losing territory to Russia. Everything depends on getting more military supplies as fast as possible, or the summer could see massive Russian advances. Remember, a year ago, there was hope of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer of 2023 that could really bring a lot of Ukrainian territory back under Ukrainian control. But now, the most likely scenario is the reverse. Russia pushing forward into the lands that Ukraine has up to this point been able to defend, but now may lose control of. EU countries are trying to help. For example, the Czech Republic has an innovative program of scouring governments worldwide to scrape together ammunition to then bring to Ukraine. But this is not enough. The USA is the main supplier of military aid for Ukraine, and Putin-friendly Republicans are blocking that aid. So looking at the course of the war from the Russian point of view, 2024 is looking pretty good for Russia. Why? Because Republicans are blocking aid to Ukraine. It's a very simple story. That is the main factor here. With Ukraine less and less able to fend off Russian missiles and drones, Russia's attacks are causing more damage than in the past. The major eastern city of Kharkiv, which Ukraine clawed back from Russia in 2022 after initial Russian occupation of the city, it's again under threat. And furthermore, the possibility of a Trump victory in November is also good news for Russia. So sadly, Putin has many reasons to smile right now. And one very recent ominous development is with the declining ability of Ukraine to defend its cities and infrastructure. There have been a number of successful Russian attacks on Ukraine's power plants. And here I'll show you a clip from a very recent PBS NewsHour report.
This year, Russia has launched a series of deliberate and devastating attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Taking advantage of gaps and shortages in Ukraine's air defenses, Russia has systematically targeted nearly every single power plant in this country. Officials here tell us the last few weeks have been unlike any they've seen before in this war.
An idyllic scene in the city of Ukrainka, just outside of Kyiv. But the Russian attack here just 3 days earlier is fresh in Gennadi's mind.
It was about 5 a.m. Everybody woke up because it was a massive explosion, and then a few more explosions.
The 64-year-old local builder struggles to describe the moment.
You need to hear it to understand it. You need to live through it.
The airstrikes destroyed their target, the Tripilska power plant, one of the country's largest power plants and the main electricity source for 3 million people in the Kyiv region and surrounding areas. It's also the center of this city's livelihood.
More than half the city's population works at the power plant.
19-year-old Alina has lived here her whole life. She had a clear view of the attack and aftermath from her window at home.
What did you think when you heard those explosions that night?
What's going to happen in the city? Will the rockets come into the city? Will they hit houses? What will happen the next day with heat, with water?
In the early morning hours of April 11th, Tripilska was one of multiple power plants hit by the Russians. That followed a March 29th attack on other power plants, which followed March 22nd strikes also targeting Ukraine's energy system.
They try, they test, they see the results and just repeat.
Dmytro Sakharov is executive director of DTEK, Ukraine's largest private energy company. He says Russia has attacked power plants earlier in the war, but this year is different.
The efficiency these days, unfortunately, is higher because of Russians develop their skills. This is basically the third year of war. They improve the technology. They, I guess, install some more advanced guiding systems.
When you say efficiency, you mean they're more efficient at causing more damage to Ukraine?
Causing more damage, yeah.
So far, an estimated 60% of Ukraine's power generating capacity may have already been impacted by Russian drones and missiles.
So this is a very dangerous new stage of the war, because if Russia can cripple Ukraine's energy system, society will begin to collapse. Now here, I want to briefly discuss the international aid picture, the support that both Ukraine and Russia have received from various quarters. NATO and the European Union, the main Western alliances, have provided massive support to Ukraine, except for a few European countries with pro-Putin leaders, such as Hungary and Slovakia, both of which have maintained friendly ties with Putin and make it difficult for the EU to take action. Japan, South Korea, and Australia also provide support to Ukraine. President Biden has played a major role in pulling all this together. And I can only imagine what might have happened if the president had not been Biden, but Trump, who has shown no interest in helping Ukraine and has a very friendly attitude toward Putin. Future American support for Ukraine is now in doubt due to Trump's pro-Putin history and his influence on Republicans in Congress who are now backing off from supporting Ukraine. Russia's main supporters are autocratic authoritarian states like China, Iran, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, and Myanmar. Some countries have chosen to stay neutral and to not oppose Russia's invasion, which in effect amounts to supporting it. Those taking this neutral position include Brazil, Turkey, India, and many nations in Africa and Latin America. Russia is also courting such countries by offering food, aid, arms, and cheap oil. But bad news for Russia, good news for Ukraine is that NATO has expanded. Sweden and Finland have now joined NATO. And this is a really momentous thing to contemplate, because both countries since World War II were very careful to keep a stance of neutrality toward Russia. This indicates that in Sweden and Finland, the governments made an assessment that the threat from Russia is so extreme now, and they have so much worry that it could expand beyond Ukraine, that they dropped their long-standing position of neutrality and chose to become parts of NATO. This is good news for Ukraine and NATO because Sweden and Finland have highly capable, high-tech armies, which will be a major asset here. Furthermore, Ukraine is desperate to join NATO. It's a difficult process because even though NATO countries are friendly to Ukraine, NATO is based on strict standards of admission. And a problem for admitting Ukraine is that a country that is divided, a country that's in a state of conflict is not generally considered appropriate for membership. But the problem with that is Russia could keep parts of Ukraine in turmoil for a long time, and then maybe Ukraine would never be able to join. So it seems to me that what's happening in NATO is that the leaders in NATO are trying to find a way to give Ukraine a kind of quasi-membership without an outright full membership. And they're also accelerating the process, the very complicated bureaucratic process for Ukraine to go through various steps toward membership. But there's a lot of bad news for Ukraine. Russia is rapidly ramping up its production of military equipment, and Western allies have been slow to increase production. American support is becoming more and more uncertain, and that gives the advantage to Russia. Furthermore, Russia has a larger population, almost 4 times that of Ukraine, and it's able to draft soldiers into its military without significant opposition. Ukraine has less population to begin with. It's a democratic country. People can have different opinions, and increasing the draft is unpopular and may be resisted. I would note that in the last month, Ukraine has changed its draft laws so that younger men are now eligible to be drafted into the army. But all these factors give the advantage to Russia. Now, a particular problem is the relationship of Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin. Trump has a long history of praising Putin and Russia while criticizing Western leaders in the NATO alliance, which protects Europe against Russia. I would ask you to try to find any time that Donald Trump has ever criticized Putin, and I think you'll come up shorthanded. Many in Ukraine, many in Europe, many in America and around the world worry that if Trump returns to office, if he becomes president again, he will do nothing to aid Ukraine against Russia, but rather he will aid Russia against Ukraine. Trump has claimed that European countries are not paying enough for their defense. He doesn't seem to understand that a military alliance is not a golf club or a mafia protection racket. It is not something run for profit. It's a group of countries standing together for mutual support and protection. And this idea that they're not paying enough is just absurd. The only time NATO has ever activated its mutual support clause and called on countries to come to the aid of another was when America was attacked on 9/11. Soldiers from across Europe fought in the wars that America started in Afghanistan and Iraq. For example, the 3 Baltic states all sent soldiers to fight and die in those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They paid the price in blood. And here, I'll play you a clip that illustrates the problem of the very positive view that Trump takes toward Putin. And here is Trump praising Putin after Russia has started invading Ukraine. Trump apparently saw nothing wrong with this.
So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's the strongest peace force. We could use that on our southern border. That's the strongest peace force I've ever seen. There were more army tanks than I've ever seen. They're going to keep peace all right. No, but think of it. Here's a guy who's very savvy. I know him very well, very, very well.
And the Washington Post put it this way tonight. Trump's reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine is exactly as you'd expect. His characteristic praising of Putin stood in contrast to the reaction from some Republicans on Capitol Hill. This was close Trump ally Senator Lindsey Graham earlier today.
I'd like to go after Putin and his cronies as hard as we can. I would like to make life miserable for Putin and those who support him because if we don't, other bad actors are going to move quickly.
And here are some of the statements Trump has made about NATO recently and about aid to Ukraine.
Former President Trump setting off fresh alarm bells in Washington and in European capitals with his latest rant about the NATO military alliance. Yahoo Finance's senior columnist Rick Newman here with more on NATO's defense spending target. Tell us about that, Rick.
Hey, guys. Right. So Trump is making heads explode again by saying that if Russia threatens some NATO member that does not pay what it is supposed to pay or spend what it's supposed to spend on defense, then he would not come to that nation's aid, and he would just let Russia do whatever it wanted. So I just decided to look into the economics of the NATO military alliance. This basically covers a group of countries in Europe that the United States has something like $1.6 trillion in annual trade with. That's the second largest trading bloc for the United States after Mexico and Canada combined. And we have about $3 trillion of direct investment in those countries. So we have an enormous stake in these countries in Europe. And Trump is right that there are about a little more than half of the member nations in NATO do not pay all that they don't pay. It's how much they're supposed to spend on defense. It's supposed to be 2% of GDP they spend on defense. And Germany doesn't do that. Spain doesn't do that. Belgium doesn't do that. Luxembourg doesn't do that. But guess who does spend that much on defense? The 5 nations that actually are closest to Russia and might be the first line of defense if Russia were try to go beyond Ukraine. So that is Finland, Poland, and the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They all spend more than the NATO target of 2% on defense. So in a way, Trump is saying he wouldn't defend Germany, I guess, if Russian paratroopers landed in Germany. But in terms of the countries that are closest to Russia and most threatened by Russia, they meet the standards. So Trump's analysis doesn't apply. And, I think you can also just make a very good case that what the United States devotes to NATO is totally worth it because of all the economic interests it protects.
So this is one of the major problems right now. A leading politician in the US basically opposes NATO and help to Ukraine, and this is greatly encouraging the Russians in their war. And unfortunately, we see a growing number of Republicans, still a minority, but influential Republicans, who now seem to actually be siding with Putin, and they're repeating the propaganda that comes forth from Moscow. And here's a little bit about that.
Right now, Speaker Mike Johnson is facing a revolt from inside his own party over his decision to finally put aid to Ukraine up for a vote in the House. Johnson had resisted doing that for months, but this week he finally relented. Here he was explaining the reality of what he is facing just a few hours ago.
I'm operating with the smallest margin in U.S. history. I have a 1-vote margin. Listen, we're not going to get 100% of what we want right now because we have the smallest majority in history, and we only have the majority in 1 chamber.
Despite what Speaker Johnson understands here, far-right members of his party are now saying they will call a vote to oust Johnson over his decision to bring up Ukraine aid. And that's going to go to the floor for a vote. That is how much the far right does not want to help Ukraine combat Russia's war of aggression. And this is not just a problem for the Republican Party. It is a problem for Ukraine and America and the rest of the world. Because Ukraine and the vote on Ukraine funding has become a leverage point for Russia. The Washington Post has some explosive reporting today on newly revealed documents from inside Vladimir Putin's government. Documents which show how Russia is seeking to subvert Western support for Ukraine and disrupt the domestic politics of the United States and European countries through propaganda campaigns and supporting isolationist and extremist policies. Russia is fomenting division over Ukraine because it wants to weaken America's role in the world.
So we see divisions in America making it difficult for the government to provide aid to Ukraine. There is no doubt, however, in Eastern Europe, there are no illusions about Russia. Poland and the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are very worried that if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, they could be attacked next. They have bitter past experience of being invaded and conquered by Russia repeatedly. They have no illusions about what Russia is capable of. Putin clearly wants to reestablish a great Russian empire. He does not accept that history has moved on and that the Soviet Union is no more. Eastern Europeans have been at the forefront of pushing for more aid for Ukraine and have vastly increased their own military spending, as we saw in the previous slide. They do not believe in any peace deal that rewards Russian aggression with large chunks of Ukraine. Eastern Europeans are extremely concerned that Trump's re-election could mean America would abandon them and let Russia invade. When I was in Lithuania last summer, I saw huge crowds cheering for Joe Biden when he was in Lithuania for the NATO summit. So finally, let me explain why this is important to Americans. This war is not only about Ukraine. It's about preserving the international order created after World War II, which has greatly benefited America. It is also about not allowing Russia to reconquer countries that have struggled to be free. America doing nothing is not a realistic option. To not defend Ukraine in Europe would mean we betray our closest, oldest allies and that our word means nothing. We would lose respect of other countries. It would tilt the world toward chaos. If you think supplying aid to Ukraine is too expensive, consider that it will cost not just money, but very likely American lives if Russia attacks other European countries and full-scale war breaks out, because we are members of the NATO alliance sworn to defend each other, one for all for one. Russian victory in Ukraine would also signal to other countries that they can feel free to invade their neighbors, such as the situation of China towards Taiwan, for example. Let me point out three particular people who have provided outstanding leadership in this terrible crisis period. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, Joe Biden, our own president, and Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. All three leaders are showing admirable qualities of rallying people, making bridges, showing courage, and working together against this terrible threat coming from Russia right now. Okay, I have one more thing I want to show you here, and I'll have to pause the screen share for a moment to set this up. Okay, what we have here is a speech that Zelensky made to the people of the Baltic states. This is actually a video that was put together by Ukrainian government, but it shows his meetings with the leaders of the Baltic countries, and you also see sites of the great cities of the Baltic states, of the military and the people.
24 лютого могло змінити історію у бік нового поневолення. Але історія зробила поворот у бік значно більшої свободи, ніж усі ми мали. У бік значно більшої незалежності, ніж ми тоді могли розраховувати. У бік значно більшої європейської міцності, ніж хтось міг передбачити. Усі народи, які не хочуть, щоб їхні діти були власністю диктаторів. Усі лідери, які прагнуть бути на світлій стороні історії. Саме тому у цій битві важливий кожен. Свобода повинна вміти вигравати у протистояннях, які розв'язані тиранією. І ми маємо виграти цю битву. Ми, усі держави, які цінують незалежність. За ці 2 роки ми усі показали найвищий рівень єдності. Я вдячний вам за це тепло, за вашу з нами солідарність. І я дякую вам всім за те, що ви з нами. І дякую вам за кожен пакет підтримки наших воїнів та усього нашого українського народу. Дякую за вашу рішучість у тиску на Росію. Я впевнений, що обов'язково прийде той день, коли усі ми зможемо об'єднатись ще одним сенсом – вейтутаге. І ми привітаємо одне одного з перемогою над Росією у цій війні разом. Я радий мати можливість сьогодні особисто вам подякувати. Подякувати за те, що ви на стороні свободи.
And I think I have a little more, at least to show you the email address if you want to reach me. So let me put the PowerPoint back just for that. Ah, yes. I wanted to say to you, there are things you can do to help. Tell others that saving Ukraine is important, because I know from my position as a teacher that many Americans are not really aware of the stakes, or they are simply indifferent, or they've become isolationists. Talk to your family and friends. Call or write to your congressmen or congresswomen and tell them you want to see aid to Ukraine approved. Reject the view that we should not give any help to Ukraine until we solve the border issue. That was the line being taken by some Republican opponents of Ukraine aid. To say that we can't aid Ukraine until we take care of the border is like saying we should not treat heart disease until we cure cancer. The two issues are separate. And above all, vote for pro-Ukraine candidates. And back to the beginning, but just to show you my email. So if you want a PDF of the lecture or a list of the videos, send me email and I'll get back to you. Okay, I'm sorry, I've really eaten up the time, but if we can go a little longer, Devin, I'm happy to take questions.